Friends and colleagues, welcome. I'm so excited that you chose to be with us today for our first installment of the Living Legend series. This is an idea. I think as a profession, sometimes we forget to pause and honor those that have paved the way for us and made this such a wonderful profession to be a part of. And so this is in part an aim to do that, and a tribute to the great lawyers and judges that have been here locally in the Dallas bar and have paved the way for lawyers like me and you to have a wonderful experience practicing here in Dallas. And our first installment is certainly a wonderful example of that. Judge Mary Murphy, she has done it all. She has been a well-respected and thriving practitioner. She was a great lawyer. She was a partner at a large law firm. She worked her way into the legal profession by working two jobs and putting herself through school and ultimately going to law school after having experience at a law firm. She worked at two very respected and reputable firms, became partner at one, and then later was the first civil master for our civil district judges here in Dallas County. And that position later became the associate judge position that we all know about now. And then she served a time as a district court bench judge, as well as an appellate judge bench. And then she was the presiding judge for the region that encompasses Dallas and a lot of surrounding counties for a number of years. Along the way, she had a family, had two children, and developed wonderful relationships through the bar and other philanthropic organizations. So she is, for lack of a better term, the poster child, so to speak, as someone who was not only a trailblazer, but had it all. So I really hope you enjoy this interview with Judge Murphy and what she has to say and to offer to our profession. Judge Murphy, thank you so much for doing this and for agreeing to be our first installment of our Living Legend series this year in the DBA. It really means a lot to me that you agreed to do this. So really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you.
Now we're going to talk a lot. You had a distinguished career as a lawyer, or were an accomplished lawyer, an accomplished jurist. You sat on many benches. And we're going to talk a lot about that. But before we get into that, I just want to know a little bit about where you came from. And you did not come from a place of privilege. You grew up in East Texas. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you. Well, I was born on a farm in Eustis, which is a little town between Maybank and Athens. My father was a farmer and my mom was a housewife. Neither of them had finished high school. Unfortunately, my father became ill when I was about 6 weeks old. So my mother had to take over, and she raised me and my sister as a single mother. We wound up between second and graduation from high school in Mesquite. So I hail as a Mesquite Skeeter. And that sort of tells you a whole lot right there.
So, and then you didn't immediately go to college. You went into the workforce at that point. Is that right?
I did not. You're exactly right. I went to work immediately out of high school, and actually in 1972 joined the firm of Thompson and Knight, Simmons and Bullion as a word processor. So that was my beginning in the legal community at age 19.
And Thompson Knight was a large law firm at the time, right?
It was.
By Texas standards anyway, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
It was enough that they needed a word processor.
Yeah, that's right. I've never been in a firm large enough to have a word processor, so that should have told me something. Okay, so and then you worked your way up through Thompson Knight. Tell us a little bit about the different positions you had at the law firm that you held before you ultimately went back to school.
Well, I was a word processor for a couple of years, and then an opening for a legal secretary came open, and I applied for that, and I became a legal secretary. I started working with, that would have been actually in 1973, because it was right after Greg Huffman, my current husband, joined the firm, and I worked for him and John Martin and Walt Mizell as a legal secretary. In 1975, I decided I was going to become a lawyer, so I had to go to undergraduate school. So at that point, I convinced the firm they needed a nighttime word processor, and I started school at North Texas on a full-time basis and worked at night at Thompson in the night. After a couple of years, 1977, I convinced them they needed me as a paralegal. So at that point, I had 2 years under my belt at North Texas. I transferred to the University of Texas at Dallas and spent my last 2 years working as a paralegal at Thompson and Knight while I went to finished up undergraduate school.
And so I'm curious, from what it sounds like, you had just made the decision you were going to go to law school, and that's what motivated you to go get your undergraduate degree.
That's exactly right.
And so what did inspire you or influence you to become a lawyer?
The first woman attorney came to Thompson and Knight in 1973. Her name was Emily Parker. And I looked at Emily and immediately decided that I could do that too. I was not smart enough to realize I wasn't as smart as Emily was. I think she graduated #1 in her class in law school, but she was my inspiration. And I have told her that my entire legal career. She actually thinks I was her legal secretary at one point, but I don't remember that.
Well, it's great that you still have that relationship. Now, early mid 70s, give us an idea here. You mentioned that Emily Parker was the first female lawyer. How many lawyers were at Thompson Knight at the time, roughly?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know. My best guess right now would be in the 40 to 50 range, but I don't know. I don't know.
So 40 to 50 lawyers, there's one female attorney at the firm at the time, and you decide you want to go to law school. Did you communicate this to people in the law firm, or did you just kind of silently go on this track?
I did. I had an epiphany, so to speak, and called up at least one attorney and said, "This is what I want to do."
What kind of reaction did you get?
The first reaction I got was, "Well, you can't do that. You have to be smart and have a lot of money to go to law school."
And so what?
Well, that motivated me to go to law school.
I was going to say, knowing you, I bet what kind of response that got. But did you receive any encouragement, or was most of the reaction or feedback negative or neutral?
There was a lot of concern, actually. There was one partner who didn't think I should be going to law school and have to work, that would be unmanageable. And, people were concerned. I think they cared about me. I'd basically grown up there. I was still growing up there. And I think it was a concern. They wanted me to be okay. And they were worried that I wouldn't be.
Okay. And then you ultimately went to law school at SMU. Is that right?
I did.
Okay. And it seems like, from what I've reviewed, you did fairly well there. You were pretty well recruited there. Where did you what was your first job that you landed out of law school?
Well, first I will say law school was a very humbling experience. I went in thinking I'd be #1 in my class, and I absolutely wasn't. I wasn't even close. That was 𝐓𝐸𝐿, and she was #1 in our class. But I did work hard. I had several jobs. I wound up accepting a job first year out of law school in Denver, Colorado, at the 𝐓𝐸𝐿 firm.
Okay, now 𝐓𝐸𝐿, that sounds like a familiar name. Any relation to our Supreme Court justice right now?
It is. His grandfather, John 𝐓𝐸𝐿, had been one of the founders of the firm, and his father, David, was a partner at the firm at the time I joined it. And it was in Denver. They had come on campus to interview, and I got lucky and convinced them to hire me, and they made me an offer. I went and clerked in 1982, my summer after my second year of law school, and they made me an offer, and I couldn't. I had fallen in love with Colorado at that point, and I couldn't turn it down. So I went back there.
So it's interesting, a firm, in the early 80s comes from Denver and recruits on campus at SMU. Who recruited you, and did you have any type of relationship with them going forward? Or
That's an interesting story.
Okay.
I'd never heard of them at the time they came on campus, and I was intrigued. #1, they granted me an interview, because back then you didn't get all the interviews you signed up for. And the person they'd sent to interview was an African-American partner named Wiley Daniel. And Wiley Daniel wound up becoming a federal judge. And I've just learned recently he has passed, which makes me sad. But he really became one of my mentors at the firm, and we had a wonderful relationship. He was given authority to make an offer on the spot. He made one, and I was close to accepting right on the spot as well. I really did enjoy the people in the firm and was thrilled that they wanted me.
And what kind of work did you do up there?
Litigation.
So your whole practicing career before you became a judge, you were always in litigation?
I have been, other than at Jenkins. I was also in the intellectual property section, but it was doing litigation. And then there are those family law cases I took on a pro bono basis. And one of my pro bono activities also was the arts. The Dallas Association, like Dallas Accountants and Lawyers for the Arts, and Texas Accountants and Lawyers for the Arts. So I wound up with a lot of artists as pro bono clients as well. But other than that, I pretty much did litigation.
Are those organizations still around, you know?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I lost contact. I was on the board actually of the Texas Association. I don't think they are anymore. That's a good question, Aaron.
I know, interesting. But at some point you decided to come back to Texas, and you joined the Dallas firm, the Texas firm, Jenkins and Gilchrist, right?
I did.
Okay. Now, a lot of people that are watching this that may be younger than I am may not know about Jenkins and Gilchrist, but they should, right? I mean, it was a huge Texas law firm.
It was a large law firm. It was, and it had quite a unique history. I think it started out or began growing because the firm represented the Dallas Cowboys. So it definitely had a history. And I had the audacity to say I wasn't a Cowboys fan at the time they interviewed me, but they didn't hold that against me.
And what size firm was it at the time? You came back, was this around 1990?
No, it was in 1986.
86, okay.
I came back when Greg and I got married, February 1, 1986. And okay. That's when I joined it as an associate in litigation. I'd been practicing 3 years at that point. And it was comparable to Thompson Knight, I think, in size.
Yeah. It was it imploded about 10, 15 years ago, but my recollection is it got up to, it was like a 700 lawyer firm, had offices across the country at one point. It was really one of the larger Texas firms at one point, wasn't it?
That's true. I left in 97 and we had offices in different places at that time, but it had not grown to the extent it did after I left. I'm not suggesting it grew because I left.
So at some point, did you make partner at Jenkins?
I did.
Okay. And there was something significant about that, wasn't there?
I was the first woman partner in litigation. And it was at a time, it was the end of 90, the beginning of 1991, when clearly the legal community was becoming, it was moving into an era where business was a significant part of making partner at law firms, or at least at larger law firms. It was a reality. And so it was a challenging opportunity. Okay.
And you had some success developing some business at that time?
It was growing at that point. I began to focus on that early on because it was clear that was something that was going to be important. And I had become involved in a lot of bar organizations, including the American Bar Association, and specialized in computer litigation. So I did a lot of work with the ABA and the Computer Litigation Committee, and ultimately wound up chairing that committee. And that became a source of some business for me. Another source of business actually was working with people in other sections, working closely with people in corporate or real estate. So if they needed someone in litigation, hopefully they would think of me to help them out. But it was a reality that I definitely had to deal with coming into the partnership.
Did people talk to you about that, or were you ever mentored about how to develop business? This was back in the early to mid 90s. Do you remember having any conversations like that, or encouragement, or?
There was definitely a lot of focus on it, and we had a lot of help, I guess, in terms of telling you just had to go out and ask for business. I was never really good at asking someone to give me business. So I approached it from building relationships and getting to know people so that they knew me and they knew what I did, and they had more comfort or had a comfort level in me. So I never was one of those persons that brought in a lot of business, but the business I did have was extremely loyal. In fact, many of them still remain friends of mine.
I noticed you talk about friendship a lot. At least in your style that you were comfortable with, was that important in developing relationships that ultimately led to business for you? And if so, why and how, I guess?
It was for me. I was never comfortable with telling someone that I could be a good lawyer or I could handle this well. I needed to show them or give them enough information that they could build on that. So that was important to me. We're all different. Different people do it different ways. I had partners who could go to lunch with somebody and come back with millions of dollars worth of business just because they had that talent. I don't think I had that talent. I certainly wasn't comfortable with it.
I think I'd respectfully disagree with you. I think you probably had that talent. I think you just went about it in your own way. And I hope that whoever's watching this takes a couple of points from that. Is one, that it is, if you're going to be in private practice, it is important to focus on developing business, but there are all sorts of ways to do it. And you were very successful doing it, being in your own personality with your own style. And I'm just curious if you would encourage others to do the same, especially other women lawyers who may not be like you. I'm that way. I do not feel comfortable going out and asking people for business. I have to develop relationships along the way. And I'm curious what your words of wisdom would be, so to speak, for others.
Well, I totally encourage everyone to try and build those relationships. Number one, they're just important to being a lawyer and being a human being. So, and also through the bar associations, which is one of the ways I did it, I met and have lifelong friends through those relationships. You know that. Through the Dallas bar, I actually had to resign from being chair of the board because I came in. That's when I became a judge, and it was at a time when a lot of money was needing to be raised to rebuild the Belos. So I didn't feel I could operate in that capacity. But I still feel about so many of the people that I've worked with as family, people that I'll care about the rest of my life. And we did a lot of projects that you feel good about, building homes, working with high school kids, working with young lawyers. So I totally encourage those types of activities. Even if it doesn't bring business, it makes you feel better about what you're doing, and it brings together the community in a really helpful way.
No, that's so well said. So well said. Well, I want to go back to being a partner at Jenkins, and I don't want to pass upon the fact that you were the first female partner in the litigation section. I'm just wondering, for those of us who weren't there, what was that like, walking into that room where it was all men and yourself trying to run a section, so to speak?
It was a challenging time, and we were a group of lawyers that weren't shy about expressing our feelings. So we had our ups and downs, and I certainly fought for things that I thought were important in the firm. And sometimes it was agreeable and sometimes it was a disagreeable. It was just a really challenging time. But I will say, so many of my former partners and some of the associates who are now partners at some of the firms that are Jenkins merged into or wound up with, a lot of the partners from Jenkins are still good friends, and I still respect them highly. So it was a tug of war at time, but we had our challenges.
Sure. So I just wondered, what kind of advice would you give to people like me? Like, for instance, we have a relatively new firm, and we've got a new section, a young section, and we made our first female partner a year or so ago. What advice would you give to me or others about making someone, Ashley Sims in my case, feel welcome and feel part of the team, so to speak, so that it's a fully integrated experience when that happens?
Well, I think an open and honest culture is important. And I think respect among everyone is important. It's not just about being a woman in a law firm. It's not about being a young lawyer in a law firm. It's not about being a minority in a law firm. It's about being partners and working together towards a common goal and respecting everyone. I mean, one example I would use is for example, I had two children while I was at Jenkins, one right before I made partner, one 3 years before that. And I didn't want to focus on me having a baby. I wanted to focus on the fact that there were a lot of partners or associates in my age group that were having kids. And it was important for all of us, not just me because I was a woman, but it was important for all of us to be able to bring that family into what we were doing. It wasn't separate from our law practice, because we spend way too many hours in our law practice or as judges or in the legal community to exclude your family from that. So for me, I wanted it to be about all of us, not to say, oh, well, you're a woman, so we need to treat you this way.
That's what very well said. Very well said. Give us an example. You said that you wanted. You're right. You have to, if you're going to do this job well, you have to spend a lot of hours doing it. Yet you were able to have two children and have a wonderful family, great relationships, obviously, that you have to this day. Give us an example of how you brought your family into that and made that work in a time where not a lot of people were doing that, so to speak.
Well, I can say the kids ran up and down the halls at the law firm quite a bit. Back then we had dictaphones, so if I can ever find anything to play it on, I have some old tapes where they came and helped me with my work. But to let them know, they were part of it. I could be working at home on something and I would involve the kids. I can't tell you how many times when I was out speaking, whether at an ABA function or a Texas bar function or local, that I didn't involve something that the kids had said. They knew what I was doing. They were part of what I was doing. They were part of what Greg was doing. We both traveled a lot as lawyers, so we tried to coordinate that so we had a parent at home all the time. Tried to get to all their events, but we couldn't. We did what we could. I've always said if I had been a full-time member who got to go, head up the PTA and go to the PTA meetings, my kids would have hated it because I would probably cause so much trouble. They would have been embarrassed. So with my personality, I think it worked. And I think that's important to everybody to think about. You have to do what works for you and your family. And the same pattern doesn't work for everyone. And if at some point it wasn't working for us, I would have changed. I maybe wouldn't have worked as much. In fact, there were times when I cut back on my hours so I could do different things. But you don't do that by just saying, I'm going to be gone for 6 months. Or at least that's not the way I did it.
Yeah, you didn't do it that way at all. In fact, when you had your children, how quickly did you come back to work after having kids?
I'm notorious for that, so let's not go there.
Okay, all right. Well, you are a hard worker. I mean, it's evident in every step of your career. You're not only a hard worker, but you seem very driven and determined as well. Where does that come from, do you think?
And maybe it's how I got to where I am. Maybe it's from making that commitment and putting in the effort to go to school and work, sometimes 2 jobs. It meant a lot to me to do what I was doing, and that has to be part of it. I may have a gene as well that can't be removed. I don't know. But I do tend to throw myself into things, and then when I can't anymore, I tend to come to a stop and change course.
Well, it's obviously served you. Those traits have served you very well. I want to talk a little bit more about Jenkins and about being a partner there. You mentioned that it was free spirited and that everyone had their own opinions, which is great. But there had to be, I would think, some uncomfortable moments, during that time. Do you feel comfortable talking about any of those, or what?
There were times, and I've told you before over the years. I'm not sure I'd always do things the same way, but they are what they are. I remember one time in litigation, there was I was a partner by then, and there was a young associate who refused to work with me. And he also was sharing a secretary with a female associate, and he really bullied her. And I went to the mat, I went to a partners meeting and demanded that he be terminated because that was, inappropriate. He wound up being reprimanded and he wound up leaving the firm. But I took a very aggressive stand on that. And there were other situations where similarly, if things were said that I thought were inappropriate, I acted on them. I'm not sure I'd do it all the same way, but it was what it was. And it has helped to change things, I think.
So I'm sure it has, and I'm sure it did at that firm and hopefully has along the way. But I'm curious, you said You said that you're not sure now if you would have always done it that way in the past. Would you still taken a stand on the issues, or would you have just handled it differently, when taking the stand, so to speak?
I would definitely take the stand. I mean, I often think we don't speak up enough, but then sometimes we speak up too loudly, and that impedes progress. So it's a balance of knowing the right way to handle things, and I cannot even begin to tell you I've done it right. But I do recognize that every situation is different and you need to find a way to handle it. I tried in litigation, for example, because most of my opposing counsel were male at the time. I tried to use a sense of humor when I encountered things that were inappropriate. And I think a sense of humor, although occasionally it can get you in trouble, it's also a wonderful thing to be able to hang on to. You can't take yourself too seriously, because if you do, you're going to get knocked down a whole lot. And it's easier to get back up if you've been able to use a sense of humor most of the time.
So I've known you a long time, and I've always noticed that about you and admired that, is you've always used a sense of humor to kind of make others around you feel comfortable. I remember one particular case that we had. That was a very tense case. There was, a lot of tension between the parties, so to speak. It was in your courtroom. There were 50 lawyers every time this case got called. And you had these, back then you had paper files. You didn't have, e-filing, and you had this huge stack of files that you were walking up onto the bench with. And I remember you said, don't worry, the next judge that takes the bench presses a lot more than I did. And at that moment, it just made everybody feel comfortable, and we got down to business and did what we needed to do. So it seems like you've always been able to do that.
I've tried. Sometimes you gotta be careful. Sometimes it comes out the wrong way.
No, not at all. So let's talk a little bit about your journey to the bench, and your first journey was that of a pioneer, so to speak. You took a position here in Dallas County that really hadn't been occupied before. It was brand new ground. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's one of those times when I had just expended every ounce of strength in my body, and I came to a screeching halt. It was January of 1997. That past year, I'd had about 3,000 hours and 2 kids, and many of those hours were bar related or business related. They were not billable hours. I had, I think, about 2,000 hours. But I just came to a screeching halt and decided I needed to take off a year. I was in a financial position where I could do it. I saved money, and I didn't think Greg would complain too much. But I turned in my resignation and went down to the courts, and they'd been whining a whole lot about needing help. And I volunteered my time to them for the rest of the year and said, I'll do whatever you want me to. Mike O'Neill was the presiding judge at the time. So I went to him and surprised him one morning at 8 a.m. and said, I'm here to do whatever you want me to. And that was the beginning of one of the best years of my life.
And in that position at the time, it was called a master, right? Is that right? Or
well, there wasn't a position. He and Bill White put their heads, scratched their heads and put them together and said they wanted me. There was a provision in the statute that allowed for you to appoint a master. And so I filled that position. We went through a lot of commissioners meetings, and they couldn't believe I was wanting to work for free. So they had trouble wanting to approve that. But it was a great year. It was an experiment. I heard lots of cases sitting for almost everybody. There were a couple of judges that didn't want to refer things to a master. They're now known as associate judges, as you know. Right. But I was an experiment, and I was able to help with reducing the backlog. Back then, we thought it was an awful backlog of about 1,000 cases a judge. Now it's obviously grown to worse than that for many of the judges. But in the interim, we were able to reduce the backlog and provide a backup so you could get hearings more quickly. You could get to the court within a week or two and not have to wait 6 weeks for a hearing.
And because of that experience, the district judges made that a permanent phase of the operation, so to speak. 2 associate judges are there now and are paid positions.
They are. And the commissioners have to approve that, obviously. So they got that through. Sure. And I would say the Bar Association was a huge help in that regard. In fact, I think the overwhelming support for a position at the bench bar conference that year helped persuade the commissioners that it was something that they wanted to approve. And so as a result, they did.
No, that's great. That's great. I know after spending that year, you went back to private practice for a while, but then came a point where you decided you wanted to become a judge full time and run for a bench, right?
I was approached several times to run for a particular bench, and I finally gave in and said I would do it. That was in 1999, and I ran for the 14th District Court that year.
Okay. Talk a little bit about that decision, because that decision is not just about applying for a job. It's also about, entering the political atmosphere, so to speak. And was that difficult for you? Or?
It was very difficult for me. Although I will say in retrospect, being out there, meeting people and talking to people on a regular basis was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. But one of the most distressing things was I think, first was raising money. I hated that. I hated asking people for money, just like I wasn't good at asking people for business. Asking people for contributions to me is extremely distressing. But the other is the way our system is set so that you have to run on a political party's ticket makes it appear to some that judges are associated with making decisions based on what party they belong to. And that's also equally distressing to me, because judges are judges. They're not Republican judges. They're not Democrat judges. They should be judges who try and apply the law and give access to justice. And by putting the political moniker on it, it makes it appear to some that it's not a fair system.
So I want to ask you about that. And you certainly don't have to go into your individual politics, but I'm just curious at this time, did you feel a strong affiliation to one party or the other? Or?
I did not. In fact, the year I sat as a master, I absolutely distanced myself from anything involving politics at all, because I didn't think it was appropriate to be talking about politics as part of what you're doing or being at the courthouse or any of that. So that year I took off, I tried to distance myself from any party, but then the reality was, to run for office, I had to be associated with the political party. And my friends convinced me that I could do that, and I did.
So I'm curious about that, because at this time, and around 2099, for a long time in this county to get elected, you had to be a Republican, and then that changed, and now the perception is to get elected you have to be a Democrat. I'm curious for what advice you would have somebody like that maybe had a similar feeling you did at the time, that didn't really have a strong affiliation with a party. Would you still encourage them to go forward if they want to, and they want to serve, and they want to serve on a bench? And how would you maybe give them advice to do that?
That's a hard one, Aaron. It's a personal choice. You have to get comfortable with it within your own skin. And we have people running for judge who can be political, but we have others who don't have an ounce of political aspiration at all. I think it's a very personal decision. I think we need judges who care about what they're doing and not about the politics of it. That's very difficult. I mean, I would really hope for judicial reform. I feel strongly about that. And I think we're making progress. If we can take politics out of it and come to some merit-based system that's not political, I think it would be extremely helpful. But it's been a long history in Texas, and I'm not sure in my lifetime I'll see that change.
That's really interesting. So when you took the bench, I believe Judge Johnson was there at the time, wasn't she? Now Judge Scholar, yeah.
Karen Johnson, Scholar, and I ran at the same time. So,
okay. All right.
In fact, they made jokes about us being the shoes, Johnston and Murphy. But yeah, we ran at the same time, and she took over the 95th when I was elected to the 14th.
And when you did, were you the only two females on the civil district bench at the time, or were?
Right. Oh no, Katharina Haynes was there, Margaret Keller was there, and Ashby was there.
Okay.
That may have been in on the district court level.
Okay. All right. And then at some point you decided to change and run for the appellate bench, right? And why was that?
Right. I was there along with Judge Ashby and Judge Johnson, who's now Scholar, in 2008 when everyone who was up for office that year who had an opponent was kicked out of their office. And so there was a changeover that year, and we were still there because we were on a different cycle of being elected. So I knew I either had to not run, I would have to change parties, or I would have to do something else. And I was really struggling with that because I did not feel like I could just change parties, although I don't criticize anyone who is willing to do that. I just couldn't do it. And it's not because I was so strongly feeling that I had a political base. It was that I just, out of principle, I wasn't going to do that. So I was struggling with what I was going to do when I understood that Judge Whittington, or Justice Whittington, was not going to run again. So I immediately threw my hat in the Court of Appeals race.
You weren't afraid to stand on principles, as we've talked about, but there was even campaigning. You returned campaign contributions at times when you didn't draw an opponent, right?
I did.
Okay, and well, I'm sure the donors were thrilled about that, and the law firms were thrilled about that. That must have been.
Aaron, that's a good point. Some really were, but I'm not sure everyone was. And I remember one time, right before I was about to have a big hearing in my court, someone came in from out of town and decided to make a contribution to me, which I refused. It was very obvious. And then I recused myself from that case. But I think lawyers are under the mistaken belief that if they give contributions, they may get a more favorable ruling. And that just breaks my heart. So shouldn't be that way.
Shouldn't be that way at all. We shouldn't.
Right. Some of those lawyers wanted me to keep the money, actually.
But that might have, I'm sure not all judges took that position. And did that cause any tension at all in the judicial ranks when you did that, or?
I don't know. I just did it and went on.
Okay.
It was something I felt like I should do.
Okay, that makes complete sense. And how long did you serve on the appellate bench?
I was there from 2009 to the end of 2013, so about 4.5 years. I left. I had to retire because I was offered a position as the regional presiding judge, and at that time that covered all of Northeast Texas, about 39 counties. And after I went and talked to the governor's office and the Office of Court Administration, after they made me that offer, I decided I wanted to do that. So I retired from the Court of Appeals and accepted that position in October of 2013.
And so there are even a lot of people in litigation that probably do not have a full or great understanding of what that position is or what it entails. You mind telling us a little bit about it?
It is multifaceted. It involves a lot of things. It involves the assignment of visiting judges. It involves handling recusals. It involves what most people don't understand is appointment of associate judges that cover things like child support and foster care. There are a lot of, there's a monthly board meeting where you discuss a lot of business that affects the state of Texas, and it has to do with allocation of resources. There are a whole lot of things. And in fact, I think they're endless that position involves. In the first region, which is where I was, it was huge, as it was in the second region, which included Houston, just because of the number of judges. I had over 200 judges in my region. So trying to keep up with them was a challenge. Since then, the legislature has created 2 more regions and divided that up. So Region 1 now only has 7 counties, and it's much more manageable as does the second region got split up too. But one of the things that appealed to me was the fact that it does involve so much hands-on work with our foster care system and the child support judges who hear cases. And that struck a nerve with me. So I was excited to do that. I wound up being a liaison to the Children's Commission, and that was an extremely rewarding experience as well.
Yeah, that's children. That's been an area of passion for you. I can tell from talking to you. Talk a little bit about what you've done in that area. I know you've sat on a board or 2 and been involved with some organizations. You want to talk a little bit about that area and that passion?
It's something that there just aren't enough resources for. Our foster care system, as you know, is in distress. There aren't resources. I have sat in family courts as a visiting judge, and part of that is getting the training and getting the knowledge about child welfare rights, and it's extremely sad. I remember sitting on cases where you needed to provide support for the family. The father and mother were splitting up. There were children that are involved. They need help. They need counseling. They need parenting skills. They need these resources, and they all cost money. So ordering someone to provide counseling or ordering them to go to parenting classes or trying to order something is really useless, because if you don't have the resources to actually provide to those families, you're not helping. You're just creating a bunch of orders that don't do anything except allow the court to hold them in contempt if they don't comply with the orders. So it's a system that is needing lots and lots of work.
Interesting. So I note, I mean, a theme through, going through your career is you've not been afraid to take on multiple responsibilities, whether it's, just being a student and being a worker, or being a lawyer and being a wife and being a parent, or being involved with other organizations at the same time as your practice while you're developing business, or on the bench and also being a parent and being involved in different organizations. Yet it's becoming harder and harder to do for young lawyers. The demands on our time are just so strong. What advice would you give to us, for someone who's of your mindset or your ilk and wants to have it all, so to speak, and make sure that any challenge they want to go forward on, they can? What advice or encouragement would you give us?
I'm not sure I have any advice. I would have encouragement, because it's important. I don't think you can, there's so much required of our time and our emotions and our resources that I don't think you can separate a lot of it out. You just include your families, or you include your interests along with your legal practice and your community efforts. I think we as a legal community are getting much, much better at understanding that and respecting one another and working together with one another. So I would just encourage that we just be more and more open and have more and more communication, which obviously you're in a position that is awesome. You have lots of opportunities and I bet you get through this year and you won't know where all the time went. And there will be so many things you didn't get to do that you wanted to do, but you are the perfect person to be president of the Dallas Bar right now, and open up those opportunities for people to talk.
Thank you so much, Judge Murphy. We appreciate you. This is you've been a role model for me. I think I've looked up to you for a long time. We've had private conversations where I've asked you about things in the practice, and you've always been so generous with your time, and you certainly were generous for sitting here through this interview today. I'm just curious, before we leave, is there anything else that you would suggest for young lawyers, or any types of words of wisdom, so to speak, that we haven't come out necessarily in this interview, but just something you would like to share with those that are watching?
Well, I want to be like you when I grow up. I just want to encourage our community to continue to work together the way it has. We are facing a number of crises in our legal community and in the communities we live in here in Dallas and in a bigger picture in Texas. The movement with Black Lives Matters, I think, has made a huge difference in opening people up to having a conversation and understanding one another better. And that goes across so many different communities and so many cultures. And if we pull it all back together into our legal community, I think we can be leaders in this regard, and we have a great opportunity to make a difference. And I feel really strongly about our doing that. And you're a perfect person to be leading us through part of that. So thank you, Aaron.
Oh, thank you, Judge.
Well, and the staff at the Dallas Bar. I would be totally remiss if I didn't say that bar could not run without the amazing staff. And my hat's off to all of them. has been for years and years and will continue to be.
It's you're right. It's not even close. I mean, you spent time in leadership in the Dallas Bar as I have as well, and that support team is just unmatched. I mean, they're also dedicated and vested in the DBA's cause, and they're 90% of the success that our bar. So, and nobody ever talks about it, but I'm so glad you did. So thank you, because they are 90% of the reason that we're so successful. In our remaining few minutes, I just like to talk about mentoring a little bit, because I touched on it. I mean, you've been so encouraging to me, and I know so many others as well. You were president of your own end of court. Obviously, people thought very highly of you to put you in that position in an organization that its mission is about mentoring. How are you able to do that even now? Are there still opportunities for you to mentor young lawyers, and how do you kind of capitalize on that?
It just happens. Barbara and Michael used to tell the story about how they went into their respective law firms back in the 70s and decided they wanted specific mentors, and they took them out to dinner and invited them over dinner, and they became their mentors. I think a lot of that should still go on now. I know the bar has amazing mentoring programs, but hooking mentors and mentees up together isn't always the perfect way. It's a great way. It's an incredible effort, but just when you meet a young lawyer and there's something there that there's a connection, hang on to it and stay with that person. If you're the young lawyer, hang on to that partner or that old retired judge. I currently am working with someone I met as a law clerk at the courthouse. You never know when those opportunities are going to arise, and if you seize on them when they happen, that's the best possible world. So I just encourage people to be open to that opportunity.
That's well said. It really is a two-way street, isn't it? I mean, the mentor and the mentee have to take that initiative to not only establish, but keep that connection. And when it happens, it works wonders, doesn't it?
It can be awesome. Yeah.
It does. Well, Judge Murphy, speaking of awesome, you've been awesome as always. And thank you so much for taking time to do this. I could not be more proud that you are the first person to be. You've always been a trailblazer, and you're the first person to start off our Living Legends series. So thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. You've honored me. And thank you, Judy, and everyone else for doing this. I appreciate you.
It's great. It's great. I want to thank Judge Murphy for agreeing to be our first installment of the interview series of our Living Legends. As you can see, she's had a tremendous career, continues to have a tremendous career, and has been a wonderful influence on so many. And that is exactly the type of person I had in mind when we created this series. And I'm so excited this year that we are focusing on all women lawyers and jurists in the Living Legends series. And I'm really excited that we're partnering with the DBA We Lead program, who's going to take this gig over for me at this point. I was very selfish and wanted to interview Judge Murphy. She's been a friend and trusted mentor for me over the years, but now I'm going to hand it off to probably who should be leading the interviews, and that is the current class members of the We Lead program, as well as alumni of the We Lead program. And so next month, the Honorable Maricela Moore, who's a district judge bench right now, will be the subject of our interview, and look forward to many more interviews throughout the year. So I hope you enjoyed this first installment, and I look forward to seeing you very soon, my friends.